In the 7th century, the Tang Dynasty reigned over one of the most prosperous and cosmopolitan empires on Earth. Its capital, Chang'an, was the largest city in the world, a hub of art, poetry, and philosophy. But this was a world ruled by unshakable tradition, and the most unshakable tradition was this: a woman's power was only temporary, existing only in relation to a man. Into this world, a 14-year-old girl named Wu Zhao entered the imperial palace. She was beautiful and exceptionally intelligent, but her rank was low, a 5th-grade concubine, a talented woman. She was one of hundreds, a servant for the pleasure of the great Emperor Taizong. But this girl was not like the others. She did not just want to survive in the gilded cage, she intended to one day own it. For 12 years she toiled in obscurity, but she was watching, learning the intricate, invisible rules of power, betrayal, and survival. Her moment came not with the emperor, but with his son, the weak and pliable crown prince, Li Zhi. She began a secret, forbidden affair with him. When the old emperor died, all his childless concubines were banished to a monastery to shave their heads and live as nuns for the rest of their lives. For Wu Zhao, it should have been the end. It was only the beginning. Emperor Taizong was dead, and his son, Wu's former lover, was now Emperor Gaozong. He was a man ruled by his passions, and he was hopelessly in love with the woman now locked away in a nunnery. In a shocking break with protocol, he brought Wu Zhao back to the palace. She was no longer just a concubine, she was his favorite. This was her first move on the board. Her second was to eliminate her rivals. The current empress, Empress Wang, was barren. This was her fatal weakness. Wu Zhao quickly bore the emperor a son, securing her position. But she needed to eliminate the empress entirely. What happened next is one of the most chilling and disputed stories in Chinese history. Legend says Wu Zhao gave birth to a daughter. One day, Empress Wang, who was fond of the child, came to visit. After she left, Wu Zhao allegedly entered the room, strangled her own infant daughter, and placed the body back in the cradle. When the emperor arrived, she revealed the murdered child and, in a fit of grief, accused the last person to be in the room, the empress. The emperor, enraged and heartbroken, believed her. Empress Wang was deposed, and Wu Zhao was made the new empress consort. Wu Zetian was now empress, but she was not content to be a mere partner. Her husband, Emperor Gaozong, suffered from a debilitating illness, perhaps a stroke, that left him weak and partially blind. This was the opening Wu had been waiting for. She moved from his bedchamber to the halls of power, assisting him with state affairs. Soon she was ruling from behind a silk screen, a co-regent in all but name. Her intelligence was undeniable. She cut taxes, raised agricultural production, and promoted talented men based on merit, not just their aristocratic family names, but she was also utterly ruthless. To solidify her power, she created a vast, terrifying network of secret police. She encouraged citizens to anonymously inform on one another, and her agents used torture to extract confessions. One by one, her enemies were eliminated. The former Empress Wang and another rival concubine, who she had deposed, were arrested on charges of witchcraft. Wu ordered their hands and feet cut off and their living, mutilated bodies thrown into a vat of wine, saying, "Now you two can get drunk to the bone." She was no longer just a ruler. She was a terror. In 683, Emperor Gaozong died. The moment Wu Zetian had been planning for decades had finally arrived. Her son, Li Xian, ascended the throne as Emperor Zhongzong. He was an adult and he naively believed the throne was his. But he had fundamentally misunderstood his mother. He was not her son. He was her tool. Wu Zetian, now Empress Dowager, intended to rule openly as regent. When her son showed the slightest sign of independence, specifically by trying to appoint his father-in-law to a high government post against her wishes, Wu Zetian acted with breathtaking speed. She accused him of treason. After just 6 weeks on the throne, her son, the Son of Heaven, was formally deposed by his own mother, stripped of his titles, and sent into exile. He was immediately replaced by his younger, more timid brother, Li Dan, who became Emperor Ruizong. This new emperor understood his role perfectly. He was a prisoner in his own palace. He was not allowed to rule, not allowed to preside over state affairs, and was kept under virtual house arrest in the inner court. Wu Zetian had cast aside the silk screen and now sat on the throne herself, ruling openly as the undisputed regent of China. This, at last, was a step too far for the old Tang aristocracy. In 684, a group of high-ranking outraged officials, led by Li Jingye, raised a rebellion in the provinces, declaring Wu a usurper and calling for the restoration of the rightful emperor. They misjudged their opponent. Wu Zetian did not panic. She acted. She branded the rebels as traitors, mobilized her armies, and crushed their rebellion in a matter of weeks with terrifying efficiency. But the rebellion, while a failure, gave Wu Zetian a perfect excuse. It was the proof she needed that enemies were everywhere. She unleashed her secret police, led by her notoriously cruel official Li Junchen, on the entire court. A reign of terror began. She used the rebellion to purge the government of anyone loyal to the Tang family, any official who had ever questioned her, and any aristocrat who stood in her way. Thousands were executed, exiled, or forced to commit suicide, their families destroyed. She was no longer just a ruler. She was the architect of a new order, built on the bones of the old. She had defeated her rivals, her husband's family, and now her son. She had eliminated every man who stood in her way. For years, Wu Zetian had ruled through men. She had been the power behind her husband and the regent for her sons. But by 690, she was done with the pretense. She had spent the last decade meticulously building a case for the unthinkable. This was her true genius, not just in cruelty, but in propaganda. She commissioned Buddhist scholars to discover a text called the Great Cloud Sutra, which contained a prophecy of a female reincarnation of the Maitreya, a future Buddha who would descend to earth and rule the world in an age of peace and prosperity. It was a brilliant move, using religion to legitimize a political act that defied 3,000 years of Confucian tradition. In 690, armed with a divine mandate, she made her final, revolutionary move. She forced her puppet son, Emperor Ruizong, to abdicate the throne. She then abolished the Tang Dynasty entirely, the dynasty her husband and father-in-law had built. In its place, she declared her own dynasty, the Zhou. She then ascended the throne, taking the new name, Wu Zetian. She was not an empress consort or an empress regent. She was Huangdi, emperor. This was the same title used by the mythological dragon kings and the great first emperor of China. It was a gender-neutral term, but it had never ever been held by a woman as sole ruler. It was a political, social, and spiritual earthquake. And she was a brilliant and effective emperor. She centralized power, moved the capital, and, in her most lasting reform, shattered the power of the old aristocracy by completely reforming the civil service exams. Under Wu, men from lower-ranking families, men of true talent, could now rise to the highest positions in government. It was a true meritocracy. She was a master of statecraft, expanding the empire's borders and keeping its economy strong. But this golden age had a dark and terrifying underside. Her rule was built on a foundation of paranoia. Her secret police were her primary tool of governance. She had achieved the impossible, taking a title no woman had ever dared to claim, and she would use any means and any amount of terror to keep it. As Emperor Wu Zetian entered her old age, the very tools that had won her the throne began to forge her prison. Her ruthlessness had been her greatest strength, but it became her fatal flaw. She was now in her 70s, and her secret police had been so effective that she had no one left to trust. Her sons hated her. Her old rivals were dead, and her ministers feared her. She was utterly, profoundly alone. Into this psychological void stepped two new figures, the Zhang brothers, Yizhi and Changzong. They were young, handsome, and charismatic courtiers who became her personal attendants, companions, and, it was whispered by the entire court, her lovers. After a lifetime of iron-willed calculation, the aging emperor began to indulge herself. She was no longer the calculating survivor. She was a lonely old woman who craved flattery and comfort. She showered the Zhang brothers with titles, wealth, and unprecedented power. They became her gatekeepers. The brilliant, merit-based officials she had promoted now found they could not even get to the emperor without first bribing or bowing to these two arrogant young men. The brothers' corruption was rampant. They sold government offices, settled personal scores, and treated the empire as their personal playground. The court watched in horror as their brilliant, terrifying, and effective emperor, the woman who had purged the aristocracy, was now being blinded by her infatuation with her favorites. She had become the very thing she had once exploited in her husband, a ruler weakened by their private passions. Her isolation, born from her own paranoia, had finally made her vulnerable. Her enemies, and even her allies, began to understand that the mandate of heaven was slipping. In 705, Wu Zetian was over 80 years old and gravely ill. The power vacuum she had created, now filled by the corrupt and arrogant Zhang brothers, was no longer sustainable. Her most loyal and capable ministers, men she herself had promoted, saw that her infatuation was about to destroy the empire she had built. They had to act. A group of high-ranking officials and generals staged a palace coup. They did not move against the empress, not at first. They stormed the palace, found the Zhang brothers, and executed them on the spot. Then, their swords still bloody, they marched to the empress's bedchamber. There they found the woman who had terrorized China, no longer an emperor or a living god, but a frail, sick, old woman, powerless and alone. They politely, but firmly demanded her abdication. The reign of terror was over. Wu Zetian, the woman who had murdered rivals, deposed her sons, and forged a dynasty, had no moves left to make. She was forced to step down. Her son, Li Xian, the one she had deposed and exiled decades earlier, was brought back and restored to the throne. The Tang Dynasty was back. Her Zhou Dynasty, the ultimate symbol of her power, was abolished and died with her. Wu Zetian was moved to a separate palace, where she lived out her last few months in lonely confinement, dying later that year. And in a final, ironic act of defiance against history, she was buried in a joint tomb with her husband, Emperor Gaozong. But her tombstone, which should have been carved with the long list of her incredible, brutal, and revolutionary achievements, was left completely blank. To this day, historians debate why. Was it her own final arrogant statement that her deeds were too great for mere words, or was it the ultimate final insult from her enemies, who sought to erase the very memory of a woman who had dared to rule them? It remains a silent monument to the most complex, brilliant, and terrifying woman in China's history.